Good morning. We're starting the recording for our organization. And yes, I want to let everybody know that if you're coming on right now, you are automatically muted. And we're going to get to the housekeeping in just a minute. So welcome. Welcome to our briefing of Does News Coverage of Traffic Crashes Have Perceived Blame? I'm your co-host, Melissa Balmer, the founder of Pedal Love, and I'm here with my contributing editor, Jim Brown. I'm going to turn most of it over to Jim and the others today because I'm having a little bit of a problem with my mic, but I did want to greet you and tell you that we're excited to have you all with us today. We have active mobility advocates, urban planners, government agencies, transit agencies, health orgs, journalists, board members, students, and more from across the United States. And we really appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much. I also want to give a shout out to Safe Routes Partnership for sharing this with their email newsletter and social media, and the Vision Zero Network for sharing this with their social media network as well, and all of you, because a lot of you really helped us get the word out, and we so appreciate it. So some very brief housekeeping notes as we get started today is that the presentation from Tara and Kelcie will be just about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have 10 minutes for your questions at the end, your live questions. So here's how you do that. Look at the top bar of your screen, and you're going to see a little text box icon. You're going to submit your questions in that box. Just click on it and it's going to pop open, and you'll see how you can submit your questions as they occur to you. And then we're going to take your questions in order that we've received them. And Jim will be sharing those with Kelcie, reading them out so everyone can hear them, and sharing them with Kelcie and Tara. They can answer them directly. Now, after the briefing, we're going to send an email to everybody who's here that shares the links to this recording, the summary of best practices, and the wonderful Twitter infographic from the research. So who the heck are we? Who the heck are Jim and I? We met almost a decade ago, and we both spent time as the media directors for the California Bicycle Coalition. And from the very beginning, we've been brainstorming on how we best bring our particular communications, storytelling, and media relations skills to those of you who are interested in creating safer, more sustainable streets across the United States. And we recognize that the online webinar platform had really untapped potential for us. So thanks to the coronavirus, a lot of you think that this is very valuable as well. And that's my very lame attempt at a joke. So this briefing is our first collaboration effort, in-depth training, and that's why we're so excited to have you here. So why are we starting with this particular briefing? You know that traffic crashes are killing people walking and biking in greater and greater numbers. What we're interested in is how to start stemming this traffic tide through communications. We became aware of the really fantastic research of Tara and Kelcie and their team earlier and quickly realized that it wasn't getting the kind of broad news attention that such important research deserved. So we reached out and asked, why not? And if there was something we could do about it. And it turns out, we found out from then that far too often great research gets overlooked by the news media because there's a little bit, that's one reason, but also really importantly, the researchers don't have the time or necessarily the skills to do specific media pitching, and that is really crucial. So that's why we're here. We're here to help them get that story out to the media specifically and to you so you share it with your network and the media. Our goal is to give you an overview of their research findings, how you can use the findings to make real change in your local, regional news, and of course, your networks. So here are our wonderful presenters today. We have Tara Goddard, PhD, Assistant Professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Planning Texas A&M, and Kelcie Ralph, PhD, Assistant Professor of Transportation Planning at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. Together with Evan Yacobucci of Rutgers and Callan Thigpen, formerly of Arizona State University, did the research and wrote, "Does news coverage of traffic crashes affect perceived blame and preferred solutions? Evidence from an experiment." And now I'm going to turn this over to Kelcie.
All right. Thanks, Melissa, for that wonderful welcome. And we are just so happy to be able to share this work with so many of you from across the country. So Melissa already covered a little bit of our motivation, but I just want to circle back. Thousands of people are dying each year in the United States, both by walking and biking. And we really were motivated to try to fix this. At the same time, we were seeing across our Twitter feed examples from the absent driver and a couple of other really engaged Twitter users just highlighting the pretty horrific coverage that existed out there. This example here, boy 14 dies after trio involved in bike crash with a van in Leeds. I mean, this news coverage is just committing so many sins that shifts blame towards the pedestrian. And we wanted to know if this was an isolated incident. Is this really happening commonplace? And if so, what are the effects on readers? So, like any good academics, we conducted a couple of studies. And in the first study, we were really focused on this question: what does news coverage look like today? Like I said, are these Twitter stories isolated incidents, or is this commonplace, all of these errors? So what we did is we reviewed 200 local news articles, 100 involving people walking and 100 involving people biking. And we read each of these articles very carefully, examining things like word choice, sentence level grammatical choices, and broader framing of the entire article. In our second study, we said, does these coverage patterns that we found, do they affect perceptions? And to do that, we conducted an experiment with 999 people, which splits evenly into 3 groups. And each group read a slightly different version of the same news story about a crash. So one group read a pretty typical coverage. One read a modified version where we focused on the driver rather than the pedestrian. And then finally, one used thematic framing. And so these are the recommendations that we suggest, and we wanted to see how it actually affected readers. So after they read a news article, they answered a couple of questions about who was to blame, why the crash happened, and most importantly, their preferred solutions for reducing the number of pedestrian deaths. So without further ado, let's get to what we found. What does news coverage look like today? Basically, we find 2 overarching problems. The first is that a series of grammatical choices shifts blame towards pedestrians and cyclists. And we're going to go into each of those grammatical choices in just a second. And the second big problem, though, is that coverage treats crashes as isolated incidents. And there's very, very little thematic framing. So I'm going to cover problem 1. My co-author Tara is going to cover problem 2 and give us a couple of recommendations. So, broadly speaking, problem 1, coverage consistently does 3 things. It focuses on the victim, it omits an agent or actor responsible for the crash, and it consistently grants agency to vehicles rather than to people or to drivers. All of these 3 things shift blame away from the driver and towards the pedestrian or the cyclist. So here's what that looks like in a table to talk through each of these 3 things. Problem 1, focusing on the pedestrian. And examples of that are a pedestrian was hit by a car or a pedestrian was hit. Those 2 sentences were used in 81% of the coverage that we looked at. So almost every time someone writes about a crash, they use a sentence that's like this. And we know from a host of media studies literature that this shifts blame to the focus of the sentence. So let me say this again. There's more blame for the thing that is the focus of the sentence. And problematically, we found that 3/4 of the coverage focused on the pedestrian. So lots of very subtle shifting. Next, many of our parts of our coverage lacked an agent. So the example, a pedestrian was hit by what? By whom? In this construction, a crash just happens. And it entirely obscures the role of a human actor in the crash. 1/3 of the coverage that we looked at lacked an agent entirely. So no mention of a driver or a vehicle. Then some articles include an agent, but they grant agency towards the vehicle rather than the driver. So we call this problem object-based language, and you see it in examples like this. A car jumped the curb, a van hit a person. All of these issues are granting agency to the car rather than the driver. And we found in coverage that this happens, that journalists refer to the driver 4 times more often than they refer to a car 4 times more often than they refer to a driver. So this is really incredibly commonplace. So we suggest 3 simple revisions. Focus on, rather than focusing on the pedestrian, people should focus on the driver. So instead of writing a pedestrian was hit by a car, very simple fix, just say a driver hit a pedestrian. We should switch from non-agentive sentences to agentive sentences, so a sentence with an agent. Instead of saying a pedestrian was hit, we should say a pedestrian was hit by a driver. And finally, we should switch from object-based language to person-based language. So rather than say a car jumped the curb, we should say a driver jumped the curb. Now, I want to say before we launch into the experimental results that it sort of feels strange to say a driver hit a pedestrian. And I want to sort of sit with that discomfort for a second and think about examples in other fields, right? We do not say a hammer hit a person. We say a person hit someone with a hammer. And that's exactly what's happening in car crashes. We should say, if necessary, we can clarify that the driver didn't get out and punch someone, right? A driver hit a pedestrian with a car. So what is the effect of making these extraordinarily simple shifts? It reduces the blame on the pedestrian by 30%. I'm a social science researcher. A 30% effect size is a giant effect size. This is pretty remarkable. And this was from reading a single article that shifted the focus. And suddenly folks interpreted the crash differently and no longer blamed the pedestrian for their death. And in turn, that increases blame on the driver by about 30%. So we're just seeing a really simple shift with these 3 revisions to increase blame on the driver and reduce blame on the pedestrian. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Our goal here as researchers is not to start blaming drivers right and left, right? Our goal is to save lives. And so broadly speaking, we want to move beyond just blaming drivers to thinking more systematically about speed, road design, driver behavior in the system that is unsafe for pedestrians. So in order to do that, we need to change coverage just a little bit more. These sentence level fixes are not going to be sufficient. And to talk about that, I'm going to hand it over to my co-author, who's going to talk about the second problem of thematic framing.
Thanks so much, Kelcie, and hi, everybody. So if you remember back to earlier in the presentation when Kelcie talked about 2 problems we identified when we looked at these patterns that are really widespread or something that we hypothesize is a problem, it's this issue of coverage consistently treating crashes as just this thing that happens, it's isolated, and we feel that it obscures the way that this is really part of a larger public health issue and the way that the crashes are not just tied to an individual person's decision or behavior, but the larger issue of road design, law, policy, etc. So let's see if I can. I'm having trouble advancing the screens. So just to look at something beyond the word and sentence level choices that Kelcie talked about. More broadly, there's kind of two major ways to frame a story. And one is episodic, or each one as an episode. And the other is thematic. We use this term a lot. So episodic framing treats these events as isolated incidents, like I mentioned, and it really draws the attention to individual level storylines or decisions, and thus individual level solutions. The thematic framing identifies connections between events and looks at maybe trends or adds context. So it draws attention to larger trends and themes, which can increase pressure for government intervention, for example, or support for wider spread initiatives to make change. So how often, you might ask, did we see this kind of framing? It was not often. It was only in 16% of our the articles that we looked at included any of these thematic or contextual elements. So what happens when readers encounter this thematic framing? Sorry we're having some technical issues here. When readers encounter thematic framing, they're more likely to attribute the crash to other factors like road design or government planning than individual behavior. And most importantly, our thematic framing shifted support for policy solutions away from things like education campaigns to system level solutions like pedestrian infrastructure and lower speeds, which we know in the planning and engineering world are the things that actually affect behavior and shift safety significantly more than just trying to get individuals to change their behavior. So, as someone asked in the question, we have some recommendations for discussing crashes. So, for example, the simpler thing to do would be to say a driver hit a pedestrian, which speaks to what Kelcie talked about with shifting the focus away to the actor that actually did the action, right? The hitting the pedestrian. Also, including an agent at all, preferably a driver, not just the car or the SUV. And we understand that with the increase in understanding of the role in particular of SUVs and trucks, that's why people call that out. But you might say the driver of the SUV. So, and the second step would be including thematic elements. So maybe local and national crash statistics, which are very easy to pull up, a description of the area, right? So you say, oh, well, the pedestrian wasn't in a crosswalk. Maybe the police on scene say that, or that the driver says that. Well, are there crosswalks within a quarter mile or a half mile? Or is it an intersection where it's a legal crosswalk, even if it's not marked? A quote from a witness other than the driver, a quote from the family of the victim, and or maybe a quote from a planner or safety professional in the area. So then we want to tell a little bit, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up because again, technical issues. I guess we're missing a slide. Sorry about that. So one thing we did want to acknowledge before I tell this little anecdote is that we recognize that there are a lot of pressures that media face when putting out these stories, right? So they need to get the story out quickly, that headlines are not written by the same person who wrote the story. A lot of times there's pressure, or at least a perceived pressure, to report about road closures and openings, which can kind of make it diminish the fact that someone was hurt or killed there. A lot of times media are just repeating what police say on scene or replicating police reports. Or they may not have relationships with safety professionals in the community or people they're aware of that they could look at. So we want to continue to look at and work with people on those issues. But in the meantime, those simple recommendations can be immediately implemented. And then finally, I just want to tell this fun little story, what we call research into action. the way that sometimes change comes in unexpected forms. So Carlton Reid is a journalist in the UK, and he wrote about our work in Forbes magazine. And then he immediately tweeted kind of wryly that, oh, Grammarly says I should replace crash with accident, which is really the kind of opposite of what our work recommends. And of course, it's social media, so people started tagging Grammarly. And then, ta-da, Grammarly said, hi, Carlton, we appreciate you telling us about this. We're really sorry on behalf of our algorithms, and now we've released a fix. And it's not just fun, but this really matters. Grammarly has about 7 million active daily users. And so this has the potential to affect a lot of change. And also it's a fun potential of seeing social media at work. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim to moderate the Q&A.
Hello, everybody. Jim Brown here. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We've already gotten quite a queue of questions, so I'm going to jump right in with the first one. And it's from, let me scrolling up, it is from Chris Holm. Without doing their job for them, how can we help journalists with thematic reporting?
So yeah, that's a great question. And I think one thing that I'm going to go back in the slides, and we'll be sharing all these slides. So we have these recommendations that we realize, and we have some additional expanded ones that we'll be sharing as well. But one, just making them aware or advancing these, we also have this earlier, I'm sorry, I'm flipping back around to that earlier one that Kelcie shared. The other thing that we've talked about is, and this is where we'd really love to hear from journalists, is what would be the most helpful? Is it having a template that comes from the Associated Press and comes out as guidance to help you plug in individual things? Is it more just having a general checklist or guidance? We're not, the beat reporters, we're not the folks doing this. So we really do want to hear from them about what makes it, or what would be the most helpful once they're aware of these issues.
And Jim, if I could just jump in, one thing we suggest in our paper is to actually reach out proactively to journalists before a crash takes place, and to have a statement prepared that says, look, I don't know the details of this particular crash, but I do know that it's part of a broader trend, and reference either local or national crash statistics, and say, look, the common denominator in these crashes is unsafe road design, dangerous driving, high speeds, and sort of bring it back to locally suggested infrastructure improvements. So you can make the case as advocates to reach out to victims, suggest what the common denominator is across all of these crashes, and link it to specific things you'd like to see on the ground. All of those things proactively will help the very busy reporters be able to do their job.
So this is Melissa, and I'm going to jump in really quick here, Jim, and I'm going to ask you, before you ask the next question, to share with everybody that, yes, these questions are going to be answered in depth right here and right now, but we have some more in-depth training. Will you talk about that? I think right now is the time to talk about that a little bit because of the kind of questions we're getting.
Sure, happy to do that. On April 14th, we're going to be holding a training with Tara and Kelcie on specifically these questions from advocates. It's a webinar for advocates to talk about how to apply these findings. We'll be talking about how to reach out to your media. We're talking about other ways you can use the information contained in the report to advance your advocacy agenda around safe streets. So if we don't get to all these questions or don't go into the depth that you are interested in today, please know that that will be something we'll cover in this webinar on the 14th. We'll be sending everybody information, and I'll cover this right at the end when we finish up as well. So let me jump in with another question. One of my pet peeves is every news story I read, it is an official law enforcement or city official who makes the lousy framing. What are the any ideas for making some shifts there?
Yeah, so this is Tara. I can take that because this is one that I'm very interested in, and we as a team have been working on. So someone from the law enforcement division at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration reached out to us, and we have now pitched to present this work and engage in a conversation at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference, which is about 17,000 law enforcement, including police public information officers. So you're absolutely right. And it was something we found in looking at all these articles. A lot of times journalists are either quoting an officer on scene or maybe over the scanner, or just replicating a police press release. So we have to look upstream at some of these issues. So that's one place that we're looking to engage with law enforcement to see about changing some of these language choices and framing. We're also hoping to engage in some focus groups and interviews with public or with police PIOs. So, any advice or connections that people have about taking that piece of it forward. But you're absolutely right. That is something that needs to be looked at as well as the media reporting.
And I'll jump in and say that we'll be covering this in more detail on April 14th. When I was the executive director at Sacramento Area Bicycle Advocates, I interacted directly with the California Highway Patrol on exactly this question, and I'd love to see it explored in a little more detail. Next question for you guys. Do you have any sentiment analysis of the reports or the comments on the articles you looked at? This is from James.
So Kelcie, well, I'll just say that sentiment analysis, to my understanding at least, is really looking at kind of more of the feeling behind it, or the emotional content is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so no, we didn't look at that. We were just looking more at language choices and framing. And one thing I should have said about our experiment is we didn't isolate some of these things. So we didn't isolate crash versus accident. We changed those in the versions, but we kind of looked at these subtle changes in the aggregate. And granted, these are very short articles, so it wasn't a huge aggregate. But that's something that we think, we've talked about would be really interesting to look at sentiment in kind of comments and responses in particular. We did not find very many articles that quoted any kind of family victims or anything that I think would really qualify in sentiment analysis, but I'll let Kelcie speak to that too in case she has any additional.
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. Although I think perhaps the questioner was asking also about the comments in responding to the news.
Yeah.
We've really internalized the lesson that you should never read the comments online. But we have not done that. And I think that's a really interesting area to go to see how readers are actually perceiving this. So what a great idea. Thank you.
We have time for one more question, and we've gotten a lot of questions around the same theme, which is how do we influence, for example, the police reports that are the basis for a lot of the news coverage. Tara or Kelcie, would you like to comment on that?
So I'll just say again what Tara said earlier is that this is definitely the next step for us, is to think through how we can move further upstream. But for local advocates, reach out to your local police officers. They have a protocol, and that protocol can and should be changed. So take them out for a coffee or a beer and explain why this is really important. And I think police officers are good people. They'll respond to what you're saying. Hopefully, it will take time.
I would add to that, it really, of course, depends on the size of the community where you are. If you're in a really small community, the same officer or officers may be doing a lot of different types of the policing. And so they may receive less support or training in some of like traffic investigation in the messaging part or whatever. And so, they may really appreciate having at least a dialogue. But I would say start with your police department, public information officers, if there is one. There's certainly going to be someone that's designated as a communication point of contact. And I think that's a great place to start to form those relationships like Kelcie's talking about.
So it's 11:29, and so we're going to wrap up now. As I said, we'll be talking a little bit more about this upcoming webinar we're offering. But on behalf of Pedal Love and everyone here today, thank you, Tara and Kelcie, for being here, and especially for your work. And Please thank your research partners, Evan and Calvin. This is really important work. I also want to thank Safe Routes Partnership and Vision Zero Network for helping with the outreach for this briefing. And thanks to each of you who've attended today. We've gotten a huge response. It's really gratifying to see this much interest. You're going to be very important in this process of changing the narrative in our communities. If we can scroll, let's see, I'm going to see if I can do this. We're going to share right at the end here. Hang on. There we go. Hang on. We've got email addresses for Tara and Kelcie here, as well as the URL for the Petal Love webpage with more information about their research and our project to bring it to a wider audience. We'll be sharing those links with you by email, so don't worry about having to copy it all down right now. Along with a summary of, we'll be sending along a summary of best practices for journalists, which we discussed in the presentation today, as well as an infographic that summarizes the findings. I want to leave you with 2 steps. First, please share the link to the research with your social media contacts and allies. Your help here will be crucial in spreading the word about the findings. This is going to spread organically, but you know who in the news community talks to you and listens to you. Start with them, share the link with them, tell them that you've attended this briefing, and that's the way to get the conversation going. Second, plan to join us on Tuesday, April 14th from 11 to noon Pacific time for a live webinar for advocates. Tara and Kelcie will join us, and their research shows us that the crucial role that the news media play in making our streets and neighborhoods safer for everyone. Tara and Kelcie will join us for a discussion about techniques and practical tools that you can use for putting their research into action. Watch your email for more information about that. And again, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, okay? Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.